the few people who does not like to hear themselves talk?
Oh, I like to hear myself talk in real time. I mean, that sounds arrogant, but I mean, recordings of myself speaking always make me uncomfortable. So I think
Right.
that would be an impediment. Yeah.
Well, how you been? What have you been doing?
Most of the summer has been consumed with a lot of research.
Okay.
So I'm currently working on a very long, well, I don't know if it's very long, but it's a long study of the last part of Plato's Euthyphro. Mm-hmm. So that's mostly what I've been doing for the summer. I also taught an online course for Hartford, just intro, the same course that you had. That's not terribly time consuming, but which is good because I need the time for other things. But that's basically been what's occupied me for the last 2 months.
Did you go on like vacation or anything? Take a trip? Or?
No, I'm contingent faculty at the University of Hartford. There's no money for things like that.
What exactly is your position there? Are you an assistant professor? Or
no. So
are you adjunct faculty?
I'm technically adjunct, yeah. So it's all very complicated. So from 2012 to 2015, I was teaching part-time at the University of Hartford, just a section of intro here, a section of intro there. I had other things at the same time. I was teaching at the University of Massachusetts as part of my doctoral work. And I was also, in 2015, I was teaching at a private high school in Windsor, in the Windsor area. And so Hartford was just kind of my side gig.
Oh, okay.
So in the summer of 2017, I didn't have any other teaching lined up, and the philosophy department, as I think you know, kind of had a sort of meltdown right around that time.
Yeah.
One tenured faculty member, well, he was tenure track. He hadn't actually got tenure. Travis Tucker, he was denied tenure, which basically is the equivalent to getting fired. So if you come up for tenure and you don't get it, then you have to leave. And there's some broader story there. There's some controversy. I don't know the details, but basically he was no longer employed by the university. The only remaining tenured faculty member, Marcia Moen, she'd been sort of department head and had built the department from scratch, over the course of many years. She was thinking of retiring because she was having some health issues.
Okay.
Now, nobody expected Travis Tucker not to get tenure. So when he was denied tenure, this left the department in an awkward situation. I happened to reach out to Marcia at that point, wondering if she had any sort of, an odd section of intro that needed covering. And she said, "Would you like a full-time job?" And I said, "Yes, that would be very nice." So what happened is, as soon as I came on board, she immediately retired. And I became, even though I was temporary faculty, I became the only full-time member of the philosophy department.
Right.
There's also Brian Skelly, but he's technically not full-time. He likes part-time status because he doesn't have to have any administrative responsibilities. He just gets to focus on teaching, and that's it.
Right.
But you can't sort of rest the whole department on a part-timer's shoulders. So they needed somebody in there full-time, and as a strange, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. So I came on board for 2 years to basically anchor the department, which is, the whole thing is just a very strange situation. The university did a search for a permanent tenure track person last year. I applied for that position, but I didn't get it. The position has gone to Rochelle.
Bastards. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, in some ways I wasn't a good fit for it.
Because you live an hour and a half away, or?
No, I mean, that's actually true of a lot of people, a lot of faculty at UHart. UHart is a commuter school even for many of the faculty. I think the reason it wasn't a good fit for me is because we need to get the number of philosophy majors in the department up. And what they want to do, what the university wants to do is they want philosophy to work with other departments that have sub-concentrations. So things like gender studies, women's studies. These are all concentrations in other departments, but they're not standalone majors, a lot of them.
Right.
And I think they want sort of to put a lot of that work in the philosophy department. So people who are studying those things might do it under the auspices of a philosophy major.
Right.
So they really wanted someone who works on social and political philosophy primarily. Now, although I have interests in that and I can do that stuff, it's not my primary research area. My primary research area is Greek philosophy. So just on paper, I'm not a good fit for the position. They want somebody who, on paper, their official specialty is social and political philosophy. Another reason I think that it's probably good I didn't get that job is because I think in the end, the University of Hartford may not be a place that I want to spend my whole career. Mm-hmm. Whoever they hired for this position, the administration made it very clear that they were not going to be doing another full-time hire for philosophy for a very long time.
Right.
That means that if I were to take if they'd offered me the position and I'd taken the position, that would have constituted a prima facie commitment to stay at the university. Mm-hmm. Because if I'd taken the tenure track job and then decided I wanted to go somewhere else in 3 years, the likely consequence of that would be that they would have shut down the philosophy department when I left instead of doing another job search. So in some ways, I didn't really want the job because it kind of would have meant that a few years down the road, I would have had the difficult choice of, do I leave UHart for some place that maybe has a little bit more prestige? And if I do that, then I leave the philosophy department in ashes behind me. That wasn't a choice I wanted to make. So
burn it down.
So in some ways, I'm kind of glad I didn't get the job. This has left me in an awkward position for this upcoming year. I'm coming back to Hartford, but I'm now the lowest level adjunct position. Mm-hmm. So I'm teaching 5 classes over the course of the year, but they've dropped my pay to basically what's equivalent to minimum wage. So I'm doing almost the same job I did last year, but for a fraction of the pay. Oh. And it's not a very happy situation.
I feel like, at least I think I checked the course listings and I saw you were teaching like 3-ish classes this coming semester. I felt like that's a decent load, is it not?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few things to say here. So on the one hand, there are different teaching loads depending on the nature of the university that you're at. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you're a professor at Harvard or the University of Massachusetts, you're expected to do a lot of research as a part of your job. Mm-hmm. And so a full-time teaching load for someone in a research position is only going to be 2 classes a semester.
Okay.
Now, the University of Hartford does not expect its faculty to do a lot of research. They want them to focus on teaching.
Right.
So a full course load at the University of Hartford is twice that. It's 4 classes a semester. But you're not expected to do anything else. Just focus on your teaching.
Okay.
So 3 is still then, it's basically a 3-quarter load. But I'm certainly not being paid. I'm certainly not being paid 3/4 of my salary last year. So, the whole adjuncting system is quite perverse. Because if you're full time, you'll teach 4 classes and you'll get paid a decent salary. But if they don't have you on a full time contract, they can still ask you to teach up to 3 classes a semester, but then they pay you by the class instead of giving you a salary. And the pay by the class is abysmal. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much you know about this. In academia, this is sort of widely known how terrible the system is and how exploitative it is. And it's largely an artifact of universities now being run by people from the corporate world who are trying to sort of maximize. They want to reduce the amount of money they pay faculty, get as much work out of them as possible, and then funnel that money into things that have nothing to do with actual education.
Yeah.
And so, the adjunct system is a part of all that, and it's pretty screwed up. So
yeah.
So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. What is my position at the University of Hartford?
It's almost nil. That's what it is.
Yeah. So on the bright side, the new hire, I think she's very promising. I'm a little surprised she took the job because looking at her CV, I think she should be someplace a little bit better than the University of Hartford. But I think she's going to be very good. I haven't actually met her yet, but I think she's going to be a great addition to the faculty. So I think we got very, very lucky in getting her.
Yeah, cool. If I recall correctly, you said you're from Texas, right?
I spent my early childhood in Texas, and then my parents were divorced when I was 10, and my mother moved to Georgia at that point. So my childhood was split between Texas and Georgia, yes.
Were you born in Texas?
I was born in Omaha, Nebraska, but my parents only lived there for 1 year, so I have no memory of it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And whereabouts in Georgia would you say in Georgia you did your primary growing up?
Well, yeah. So from age 10 all the way through college, I went to the University of Georgia as an undergraduate.
Okay.
So yeah. So basically from 10 to age 21, 22, something like that, I was in Georgia.
Were you in the, which area of Georgia were you?
I was in Athens, Georgia, which is where the university is, but that was also where I went to high school. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Would you have been around, say, absorbing the culture and whatever was going on? I don't know if you're into music, but were you aware of like REM when they were?
Yeah. So in high school, I wish I'd been more aware of that side of Athens when I was in high school. When I got out of high school, I became very into that side of Athens culture. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was an avid, I was actively involved in the local music scene in Athens when I was in college. I even tried to be in a couple of bands myself, but I wasn't. I didn't have the dedication to become good at an instrument.
Well, what did you play though?
Well, my father played the guitar, and I had a bunch of his guitars sitting around, and so in college I learned to play them to a minimal degree. Mm-hmm. It was never very good. Athens, the scene, the culture in Athens. I mean, one of the reasons I like Western Massachusetts is because I actually see a lot of similarities between the culture here and the culture of Athens, Georgia. So yeah, I didn't really get into that until I was in college, but yeah, that was an important part of my sort of forming my adult identity was the culture of Athens.
So if you weren't, say, fully aware of REM at the time that they were coming up, what bands were you following during that time? I
mean, I think in high school I didn't really follow any. I was pretty conventional in high school, so I didn't really follow bands. I just listened to whatever came on the radio.
What records did you have? Who did you like to listen to?
Again, I don't even think I bought records or CDs in high school. It was really my music listening in high school
was the radio?
Was very, very passive. Yeah. And again, this might be partly a generational thing, right? Because nobody does that anymore, right?
Listen to the radio?
Well, I mean, they listen to the radio, but there's so many more opportunities for you to actively determine what you listen to now than there were in, say, the 80s and early 90s. Because then if you either listened to what was on the radio or you went out and you bought CDs. Right.
And nowadays it's more like people are ever so much more in control of what they're listening to. Right. Instead of, say, the most old school conventional way is you just listen to what's on the radio, and half the time you don't even know what's playing unless they do mention what song it was after it stops playing on that.
Yeah. So I mean, I have no. Like when I think about my high school years, I just think about sort of listening to what everybody else was listening to. And, there were the songs that were on, the top 40 lists that come to mind, but I don't remember being particularly into anything or there being bands that I followed or anything like that. And I certainly was aware of REM and I was aware of the fact that they were local and I liked them, but it didn't really sort of go beyond that. But then all that changed when I got into college and then I started work for the college radio station and I sort of, started really getting into music in a way that I hadn't been before. So,
and what would you say? Was there like a gateway kind of band that made you get?
This is going to sound very, but it was. I mean, this is,
it was Belinda Carlisle.
No, this was, like 93, 94 around that time. Okay. So you can probably guess if there was something that shifted, something in the air that might have caused a change. You could probably guess yourself.
All the grunge records.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Were you? Was it Nirvana that really stuck with you? Or was it like Alice in Chains, Soundgarden?
I mean, there was all of that. Nirvana was pretty important. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say it now, but I was into Pearl Jam at the time.
But how are you? Why would you be embarrassed?
Well, when I listen to them now, I think that of the two, Nirvana is just superior in every respect, songwriting, everything. But yeah, at the time, I wasn't capable of making those fine-grained distinctions. Not that it's that fine-grained, but...
Well, the way I think about all those bands from the grunge era, so Nirvana being spearheaded by Kurt Cobain and his very like pop sensibilities that were influenced by the Beatles and stuff. Nirvana was very much like the pop side of grunge. And then say Pearl Jam was they felt like the Who of the grunge era. They were very much the classic rock vein of
that's a good analysis. Yeah, I think that's right.
And then
that makes me feel a little bit better about
And then Alice in Chains would have been like the very heavy, sludgy metal kind of side.
Right.
And then Soundgarden, who happens to be my favorite of all the grunge bands, Soundgarden, they were the metal-ish. They were very Zeppelin, Sabbath influenced, but they still had like the sensibilities and influences from people like the Beatles and stuff.
Right.
Especially on in '94 when that record Super Unknown came out, which is my favorite grunge record and one of my favorite records ever.
Okay.
That, you know, when you hear Black Hole Sun, it's, you know, that guitar line is really psychedelic, and the production and the melody is very Beatles-esque.
Okay.
Along with the like the heavier guitar, the crunchy kind of rough guitar sound of the rest of the record.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a while since I've heard anything else on that record besides Black Hole Sun, but yeah.
So you were at the University of Georgia. I think you told me you double majored in philosophy and English.
Correct, yes.
Right? Did you always have the plan of double majoring, or was it like you found one major and then you added another later on?
Yeah, so I went into college thinking I was going to be a political science major, because in high school, I mean, I guess in some way I've always been interested in sort of thinking analytically about things like ethics. Mm-hmm. But in high school, there's not a lot of outlet for sort of doing that except for government, history, politics type stuff. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know that philosophy existed as a major or a discipline until I got to college.
Really?
So I went into college thinking I would do something like political science. But then, you know, and I think there were a lot of things happening at once my freshman year that were sort of causing a revolution in my personality. A lot of it did have to do with, it wasn't caused by, but perhaps the change in my taste in music was a reflection of some of these other changes that were happening. And so my freshman year, I decided that I was really interested in like what made people like be the way they were. So I thought I'm going to major in psychology. Mm-hmm. Then I took intro philosophy at some point my freshman year. I think it was late in the year, like spring. I think Georgia was on quarter system at the time. So I think it was like the third quarter, the third trimester in the spring. And I had intro philosophy. And that sealed the deal. I thought, all those other things I thought I was interested in, this is clearly the right way to study those things. Mm-hmm. Once I discovered that there was a discipline and I called philosophy what it was about, and then I could major in it, everything else just sort of quickly fell away, and I thought, this is clearly what I meant to do.
Right. Does that mean were you not exposed to like philosophical literature before then?
No, not in any substantial way. Yeah, in high school it was, there were references made to Plato, references made to Aristotle, but I never read any. And I never had any sense prior to intro philosophy freshman year of what philosophers did and what kind of an activity it was.
They thought really hard. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There was something vaguely to do with thinking was about all I could say before that. And then the English thing came about just because I was just really enjoying all my English classes. I was just really enjoying, T.S. Eliot and Shakespeare and Milton and all of it. And so I thought, why choose? I want to spend time reading literature, but also I really like philosophy. So I'll double major and major in the two things that are, the paradigmatically most useless things to major in. And on that note, is just to fill out the joke, I really wanted to try to find a way to work in an art history minor as well, but it just, the logistics didn't work out. So.
Well, I feel your pain, Donovan. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a double major in film and English, and I have a minor in music. So it's, in a sense, me trying to maximize my contact with the arts, and also minimize my chance at employment.
Yes, right. Yeah, the minimizing my chance at employment wasn't a deliberate goal of the choice, but it certainly was a consequence. Yeah.
Did you have a cool time at the University of Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, those were. I mean, I'm getting old now, but I look back on, especially my junior and senior year at the university, and I think those are really two of the best years of my life. I was taking, only classes that were fun for me to take. It was all philosophy, all English, and then like fun electives like music theory for non-majors and stuff like that. And I felt like I was, all I was doing was studying and reading, and I was just having a great time, and I felt really happy. And, none of the pressures of the adult world were quite real yet. It was just sort of this 2 years of paradise where I was just allowed to do what at that point were the most important things to me in the world and didn't have to worry about anything else. So yeah, and I credit the education that I got at the University of Georgia with, basically turning me into a better person. I think, I might have gotten that same education at any number of institutions, but without the education that I got there, even though I might have gotten it elsewhere, without that education, I don't know who I would have become. And I shudder to think about it a little bit.
Probably an English teacher.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I lived in the Deep South, and as I said before, I was fairly conventional in high school. My parents were deeply religious. Everybody around me, was a typical Southern conservative. I don't know had I not gotten the education that I got at the University of Georgia, I really don't know how I would have turned out. And again, I worry. I sometimes, I don't know. It's hard to speculate, but I'm glad that I got that education because I think it literally changed who I was for the better. Like it made me into a better human being. And in some ways, it's that experience that has driven me as an educator in my adult life. I've seen firsthand how a good education, especially in the humanities, can actually make people into better human beings. Right. And I'm very interested in trying to do for my students what my professors in philosophy and English at the University of Georgia did for me. So yeah, that I had a great time, and it was all, those were deeply formative years and incredibly important years for basically making me into the person that I think I'm pretty happy that I've become now. So.
Right. What did your folks do? What did your parents do?
My father is an electrician. When I was a boy, he was the building inspector for the town that we lived in, but he didn't like city politics. So he quit and got his electrician's license and wired houses for a living. My mother, until the divorce, so when I was very young, she was just a stay-at-home mom. Neither of them went to college. When they got divorced, she had to start working, but she didn't really have any sort of meaningful job history or work experience. So she started out basically just doing office work. And that's what she's done. She recently retired, and that's what she's done her whole life. Although she did actually, at one point she moved to Wyoming and was actually working in the governor's office for the governor of Wyoming at one point, still basically doing office work. But yeah, she became good at doing office work, so.
And is she still in Wyoming?
No, she's in South Carolina now.
Oh, okay.
So she got remarried to a nature photographer in Wyoming and moved out there. That didn't go very well, but she was kind of stuck out there. They wound up getting divorced, but she stayed out there for a while. And then when she retired, she wanted to move. She has some family in South Carolina, and so she moved there.
Right. Do you have any siblings?
3.
Okay. Where are you in the lineup? Are you the youngest?
Can you guess?
Youngest?
No.
Or oldest?
Oldest, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I have 2 younger brothers and a younger sister.
And what do they do?
One of my brothers, the one who's sort of nearest me in age, he might have recently changed jobs, but as of last year, he was driving a truck. And he has a wife and 1 son, and they live in Virginia. Mm-hmm. My sister has recently gotten a divorce, but for many years, she was married to a man from Montenegro. They were living in Texas. She met him. He had immigrated to Texas, and she met him while on a visit to visit my dad. So they were married, and they had 2 kids, and she was basically a stay-at-home mom. He has a fairly thriving computer business there. But their marriage kind of it deteriorated in the last few years, and they've recently gotten a divorce. And now I think she's like working in the service industry. Because again, sort of like my mother, when the divorce happened, she didn't have meaningful work history at that point because she had just been home raising children. And so my youngest brother is an Iraq war veteran who came back with some fairly severe PTSD, and he moves around a lot. He doesn't have a very stable life, and it's probably about all I want to say about that for now. So,
you said your parents are very religious. Was that the same for the rest of the family? Was there?
Well, I think, we were all passively religious because that's what we grew up with. And then, I mean, that was one of the big changes for me when I got to college was just immediately the first opportunity I had to call all that stuff into question and ask whether or not it made sense.
Right.
All that went out the window very quickly once I started asking those questions.
Okay.
So,
because I guess you could say I'm an atheist, although I don't think I identify as an atheist.
Right. Yeah.
Because I care so little about religion that if you were to give me a questionnaire and ask me what religion I subscribe to, I wouldn't even fill it out.
Right.
I wouldn't even put down the word irreligious.
Right.
Because I care so little about it. And I think I might have become a quote unquote atheist when I think I was maybe 8 years old.
Okay.
Because I just spent a lot of time in my head thinking about, there are different religions in the world. And my family happens to be Buddhist, or rather my parents are.
Right.
And I was like, I don't know about this. And Jesus, I don't know about Jesus either.
Yeah.
And at some point, it was like, you just spend a lot of time swinging around in your head. Right. And then I was like, I guess I don't. Yeah, no. Just
I too hesitate to describe myself as an atheist because that seems like a position one is dug in on. And I'm not sure that I have any opinions about religion that are that strong. The whole enterprise now just seems to me to be, I think I'm similar to you in this respect. The whole enterprise seems to be not really worth talking about.
Yeah.
I think it's worth, like, from my intro class that we do spend a lot of time talking about how Socrates' questioning of certain aspects of Greek religion seemed to go hand in hand with him starting to do philosophy.
Right.
So I think, religion has traditionally said, here are the answers to big cosmic questions. And then I do think that seeing the failure of religion to answer those questions adequately is sort of an important intellectual stepping stone to helping us sort of move beyond it.
Right.
But apart from that, I don't think that there's a great deal to be said for really even talking about it.
Did you ever have interest in, say, religious studies?
I think there was probably a little bit of interest there, probably like my freshman year early on. Okay. But again, I think that was quickly supplanted by philosophy once I sort of learned what philosophy was all about.
Right, okay. So you go on to graduate school, right?
Mm-hmm.
At
University of Connecticut and then the University of Massachusetts.
At Amherst?
Yes.
All right. What did you do at University of Connecticut? What was your work?
It was philosophy, yeah. So yeah, I actually was in the PhD program there, but I only completed the master's portion of it. Mm-hmm. And then I came to UMass to work with a specific professor on a specific topic that I no longer work on.
May I ask what your doctoral thesis was on?
Well, okay. So so one thing I need to be clear about, and I have an incomplete doctoral degree. Okay. So I know a few times you've referred to me as Dr. Cox, and it's very awkward to have to say, actually don't do that. But yeah, so this is sort of another aspect of my story that's a little bit complicated, but this is probably the right time to talk about it.
Okay.
So, and this is directly related to what I just said about coming to UMass to work with somebody who I no longer work with. So when I came to UMass, I wanted to work on Greek skepticism. So there's sort of a couple schools of Greek thought well after Plato and Aristotle that were academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. And I was very interested. I was actually working with a professor at UConn on David Hume and Leibniz. David Hume was heavily influenced by certain schools of Greek skepticism. And by way of Hume, I got interested in Pyrrhonian skepticism. So I found out that there was a professor at UMass, a fairly young guy who'd just come out of grad school himself, who was kind of up and coming and working on Pyrrhonian skepticism. Mm-hmm. And UMass was a considerably more reputable PhD program than the one at UConn at the time. UConn has gone up since then, but at the time, UMass was a much better program. So I thought, if I get my PhD from UMass, I'll do much better on the academic job market. So I'm going to transfer up there and work with this guy on Greek skepticism. So I did. And of course, the way this works is the more prestigious the PhD program, the less they want to pay attention to anything that you've done before. So even though I'd completed PhD coursework at UConn, I came up here and they said, doesn't count. You have to start over. Oh. So I said, well, okay, fine. So I did. And I made it through the coursework and my sort of preliminary exams. And at the time, I didn't have very much Greek language. So I needed to do the equivalent of 4 years of Greek before I could really start a dissertation.
Oh.
So I did 2 years of intensive Greek, which is 4 years at the regular pacing. And so then it was time to start on the dissertation. I wrote one chapter, and the person who I'd come to UMass to work with announced that he was leaving to take a job at UC Riverside, I think.
Oh.
He had done his PhD at Berkeley, hated the East Coast, wanted to go back west. So the first job offer he got back in the Berkeley system, he took.
I thought you were going to say like
UC
you started and then your doctoral advisor died or something.
Well, we'll get to that. So
wait, what?
So the area that almost no one in philosophy works on, Pyrrhonian skepticism, right? And so when this guy left, it really put me in an awkward situation. So we did have another faculty member who had just retired, who was our sort of main Greek person. He didn't specialize in this area of Greek philosophy, but we added him to my committee. He was very old. And within literally a few months of adding him to my dissertation committee, he passed away.
Did they find a third one?
Well, yeah, and that's where things started to break down a little bit. So at that point, I had another member. You have 4 members on your dissertation committee. So at that point, I had no chair, nobody to head up the committee. Mm-hmm. One of the other members on the committee was actually very sick. She was fighting cancer for a very long time. And then there was another member on the committee who was sort of, anyway, he didn't have a lot to, he didn't work in the history of philosophy. He worked on contemporary epistemology. All that to say that there was really nobody guiding or advising me on this dissertation whatsoever. And at this point, you only get a certain number of years to finish before they cut off your funding.
Right.
So at this point, my funding started to run out, and I started to panic a little bit, and I started to say, I'm getting nervous about how all this is going to end because I have nobody to work with. I've kind of lost faith in my own ability to finish this project. I'm about to run out of funding. I don't really know what to do. And this was around 2012 when I started adjuncting at Hartford. The adjunct courses that I took at Hartford in 2012 were my way of preparing for when my funding was going to get cut off by UMass.
Right.
So the funding did get cut off basically the next year. And as luck would have it, I got offered a full-time teaching job at the Loomis Chaffee School, a private prep school in Windsor, Connecticut. And they offered a lot of philosophy classes. They even had 2 other full-time philosophy teachers.
Wow.
And you don't have to have a PhD for that job. So I took it, and I actually fell in love with it. I never imagined myself as a high school teacher, but this place the students there are it was a lot like teaching college. It didn't feel like teaching high school at all.
Right.
The students there were diligent. They were intelligent. I was teaching the same intro syllabus that you've been exposed to, that you know about. I was teaching that same syllabus to 10th graders, and they were outperforming most of my UMass and UHart students quite easily. So I thought to myself, I don't know what to do about the dissertation, but I really like teaching here. I'm doing the same thing I would be doing teaching college. But I have this job. It's not a job that I'm going to get. It's a job that I have. So I decided to kind of dig in and just throw myself into that job and wait and see what was going to happen. Think about the dissertation and finishing the PhD later. Well, after I did that for 2 years, the school decided to merge its philosophy department and its history department and slash their philosophy curriculum in half, meaning that they no longer needed 3 full-time philosophy teachers. And since I was the new guy, I got the axe. And so this left me, as you can imagine, in a very awkward position because at this point I've officially withdrawn from the UMass PhD program, thinking that I was going to be teaching at Loomis for the foreseeable future. And then that job evaporates into thin air. They waited till the end of the school year to tell me, didn't give me a lot of warning. So here I am, I'm going into the summer and fall is coming up. I'm out of the UMass PhD program. I don't have any full-time teaching work lined up at the high school level. I wasn't at that time adjuncting at Hartford anymore that particular year. So the following year was a difficult year in terms of trying to figure out how to fix all this. Mm-hmm. For a long time, I had a kind of side project on a back burner on Plato that I was going to wait until my dissertation on ancient skepticism was finished. And then I had some really original ideas on Euthyphro. You know this dialogue from our class. And so I decided, you know what I'm going to do is that's going to be a new dissertation. I'm going to scrap all the old work and I'm going to turn this project that I'm actually quite excited about into a new doctoral thesis. And I'm going to ask UMass if I can come back and finish it. Now, I worked on it for a couple of years before I made the request. But in 2017, around the time I started at Hartford in the full-time position, I approached UMass about coming back and working toward a defense on this new project, and they said yes. So at the beginning of this conversation, when I told you about my research that I'm currently working on actually is the tail end of this new dissertation.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't want to call it that at the beginning of our talk because I was afraid that would be confusing because I knew you were operating under the assumption that my PhD was complete. But so this is the full story.
I heard you in class. I heard you mention your doctoral work. I'm like, oh yeah, he probably does have a doctorate. He's teaching.
It's ongoing. Yes. So my doctorate.
How far are you into? What percentage would you say you are?
We're at about 80% right now. It will be finished at some point, probably in September.
So when I address you in emails, I'll fully spell out doctor, but I'll leave off like the R at the end or something.
Right. I think it doesn't violate any professional protocols for you to address me as professor.
Okay.
So, yeah. But I'll let you know when it's actually fully permissible to call me doctor. Yeah, which hopefully won't be. It'll happen sometime this next year. I should be done with the writing fairly soon. I probably won't be granted the degree until like May, but yeah.
Dear almost Dr. Cox.
Yes, right.
Speaking of your name, when I was under the assumption that you had already completed your PhD, referring to you as Dr. Cox was, have you ever seen the show Scrubs?
I've seen it, but it was a long time ago, and I don't really have any memory of like any of the characters or anything.
There's a character on there played by John C. McGinley. His character's name is Dr. Cox.
Okay.
And so whenever I did type out an email like, "Dear Dr. Cox," I'm thinking I am sending an email to John C. McGinley. He was the red-haired guy who he like whistled a lot. He was like, really like you not to do that.
Oh, no, I didn't yet. No memories come to. Yeah, I have a similar reaction when, do you know Donald Jones in the English department?
I've heard the name.
Yes. Well, yeah, we exchange emails somewhat frequently, but it's always, I usually call him Professor Jones, but it is very tempting from time to time to write Dr. Jones. Yeah. And then I'm writing Harrison Ford. Yeah.
You started teaching at University of Hartford full-time when?
2017.
Were you only ever really teaching the intro class?
I mean, no. So I taught, as the only full-time faculty member, I taught basically everything that was on offer.
Right.
Now, we don't offer a lot of upper-level classes because we have so few majors. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so in addition to intro, at the University of Hartford, I've taught American pragmatism. I've taught a course called Rationalists and Empiricists. I've done an independent study on the philosophy of language. I've taught philosophical writing. I've taught our logic course, practical reasoning. There might even be one or two others in there. Those are the ones that are coming to mind right now.
Would you say there's a particular course you find is your favorite to teach?
Well, intro is the course that I put the most work into. So I've taught intro between UHart, UMass, and Loomis. I've taught intro more than I've taught any other single course. Mm-hmm. And, intro is a really important course because for many people, it's their first and sometimes only exposure to philosophy. Mm-hmm. So going back to what I said earlier about, believing firmly that philosophy and generally speaking in education in the humanities, that these things are important and education in these areas can change lives. Intro is my vehicle for trying to do that. Mm-hmm. In some ways, it's my favorite because it is the one that I've spent the most time thinking about, the one that I spent the most time developing, and I think the one that I think is, of all the courses I teach, the one that is most likely to have impact on students. That said, though, I do teach it so often that sometimes it can be hard to keep the material fresh. There is sometimes when it does feel, because of the importance that I attach to intro, the fact that I teach it repeatedly over and over again, those two things sometimes don't pair very well together. Something that's a very important task, that's sort of a burden on your shoulders. You don't want a task like that to become tedious or routine, right? Because then it makes it harder to bear the burden. So So there is some tension there, but I would say, probably the clearest answer to your question is, intro's my pet course, the one that I care about the most.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any particular portion of, say, an intro to philosophy course that you think is the most difficult for students to grasp?
Undoubtedly. The section of the course where we talk about cultural relativism.
Right.
And we read the essays by James Rachels about cultural relativism and ethical subjectivism. And to some degree, in combination, relatedly, when we talk about propositional attitudes and beliefs, which we do actually right after that, this material gives students a lot of trouble. It's stuff that's really important. It's one of the most important parts of the courses. This is the most frustrating part of the course to teach, because you want students on the one hand to understand that, I'm trying to say this without actually launching into the lecture. You want students to understand that certainly tolerance is, an important virtue, but to use the metaphor that I use when I teach this stuff, you want to be careful about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. Being tolerant doesn't mean that you should tolerate everything, right? That leads to a slippery slope where you wind up having to even tolerate intolerance itself, which is certainly not a consequence that we want. So trying to sort of occupy this sort of space between, you want people to understand that we should always avoid dogmatism in our views. We should always avoid unnuanced views about ethics and morality. We should always sort of make room for differing opinions on the one hand, because most of our opinions are nobody's right about everything. Most of us have opinions. Even when our opinions are more or less true, there's probably still at least a little something wrong with them. Right. And so you always want to listen to the opinions of other people so that you have an opportunity to be made aware of the mistakes in your own thinking. But on the other hand, there's a tendency to sometimes go too far with this and to say that there are absolutely no moral or ethical standards whatsoever, that every moral standard is relative to an individual or relative to a culture. But if we say that, then that robs us of any ability to make moral judgments or moral evaluations of any sort. And once we do that, we're in a position where we can no longer call actions unjust. We can't point out injustices in the world if we've given up on the idea that there are moral standards altogether. Right. There have to be some moral standards that we can rationally identify if we want to point out that people are behaving in an unjust way. Mm-hmm. Right. So it is true that sometimes being unnuanced or unreflective in your moral thinking can cause you to call things unjust which really aren't unjust. Mm-hmm. But there's got to be a middle road there. And teaching this material can be incredibly difficult because it's just for students who are not used to thinking about ethics this way, this is just the conceptual landscape here is very nuanced, and it can sometimes just be hard to be clear and persuasive at the same time about these issues.
Right. So a single philosophy course is part of the general education curriculum over at the University of Hartford. As much as you would like to think that's a good thing to have people be required to take at least a philosophy course in order to fill out their liberal arts education and perhaps expand their minds, I noticed, at least in my class, there are many more people who are very much not interested in philosophy or are not perhaps gripped by it. Some, you could say, are not capable of thinking philosophically, or at least not getting quite to the level of thought that philosophical quantification and thought requires. Do you think overall it is a good thing that they're required to take a course?
Right. I mean, this is kind of a classic problem, not just with gen ed requirements, but anytime you prescribe virtue, anytime you say, here's something that's good for you, and then you make people try to do that thing, sometimes it can be counterproductive. You can make people hate the very thing that you want them to do voluntarily. So this is kind of the classic problem with gen ed requirements is we require them because we think they're good for people to take on the one hand, but on the other hand, what that winds up doing is, students will become resentful about having to sit through a philosophy class when they're not interested in it and wind up hating philosophy for the rest of their lives for that reason. And yes, when you have a lot of people in the class who are not excited about the class, who feel resentful about being there, it can sort of drag down the overall quality of discussion and perhaps the overall quality of the experience of that class for everybody. Mm-hmm. There are definitely problems with that system. I spent almost no time thinking about what would be a better system. I leave that, and I probably shouldn't, but I leave that to the university administrators. That's supposed to be their job to work out these problems. They don't seem to be particularly interested in thinking about things like that. They're more interested in what new buildings we're going to build and things like that. But there's definitely a tension there in requiring something that you would like people to do voluntarily. But I don't really have much to say about how we might make that situation better. But there's definitely a problem, yeah.
Would you say on some level you more enjoy teaching, say, higher level philosophy courses because they're being taken by people who are interested in philosophy and can perhaps offer more to a discussion?
I enjoy both equally well. I actually enjoy the challenge of trying to win people over in intro.
Okay.
I relish that challenge. It is nice to teach an upper level class with philosophy majors who are already excited about philosophy. It's nice to be able to teach some classes where I don't face that challenge, where I can just relax, come to class, and I know we're all on board. But I also very much enjoy being, and I use this word strictly metaphorically, but I enjoy being an evangelist for philosophy. I enjoy trying to persuade people of its value. So yeah, that has its own kind of pleasure, its own kind of reward. So
I remember, at least in the class I took with you, there were quite a few people who could keep up, you could say. But I also remember a good portion of the time I'd say I was the one who was trying to grease the wheels.
Right.
Offer an answer for you to, push your lesson along to the point you're trying to get to?
Right. Yeah, there are definitely times where you ask a question thinking the answer is going to be straightforward and you can sort of just move through the material.
Right.
Like there are definitely questions I know when I ask, these are going to be the things we stick on for a while. But it is sometimes frustrating when you wind up sticking on the things that you think you're going to move through quickly. And that happens every semester with every class. I think in that class, though, we had a particular issue with that. There were points I expected that the class would accept readily and we could move forward quickly that they didn't. And we wound up talking about them for much longer than I planned to. You definitely stood out in that class as someone who, you were doing the readings. You didn't have a lot of trouble understanding the basic points but I think.
No, I wouldn't say I was doing the readings.
Well.
No, it's just that, so I do have a mind for philosophy. I've spent more time in my head than anywhere else. And I have the mental gymnastics worked out in order to figure out philosophical concepts. Well, of course, that also means, first of all, let's face it, I'm a college student. I'm not reading much of anything. But there's just so much to unpack in terms of philosophical text, like, say, those dialogues from Plato in that book that we had. I especially remember you breaking down the first line of the first reading where you were approaching it from kind of a English literature standpoint, where you were applying what English majors call a skill called close reading, where you're trying to figure out, well, these particular words, like say it was in the day, but then this one or two words, but that suggests like it's at night or something like that, and you're trying to unpack the context and the background around that particular line in order to find out what else you could glean from that information from those words, and not exactly the words themselves and what they meant. Yep. I found that to be, well, first of all, I hadn't learned about close reading yet. that particular skill for English majors and people who teach literature. Mm-hmm. And I was especially my mind was, you could say, expanded by the amount of stuff you could glean from that one line.
And or are you thinking of, we started that course by reading a little bit of Homer. We didn't actually get into Plato until about the second or third week of the course.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Because we only met once a week. That was an evening class, right?
That line wasn't from Plato. It was from the Iliad.
Right, yeah. So we were trying to sort of break down the archaic Greek attitude toward moral agency.
Yeah.
And definitely with literature, there's a lot more you can pull out of a single line of text, because oftentimes, especially in poetry, there are multiple ways. By design, there are multiple ways you can read the text.
Yeah.
Philosophy is not really supposed to work that way, although Plato's a little bit unusual because Plato's writing in a literary style.
Right.
As opposed to, say, Aristotle, which we didn't read in that class, but we read some contemporary philosophy like James Rachel's and Gettier. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of room for interpretation there. They're just telling you what they think, and they're giving you an argument. But Plato has arguments embedded in his texts, but his texts are written sort of in a literary fashion, which does open up more possibility for interpretation.
Yeah. Now to perhaps backpedal a bit, because to try to save myself from saying that I didn't read it all. But when I did try to read stuff from, say, the dialogues of Plato, just the way it's written or you transliterated, it's very dense, you could say. There are things that I would read because I'm reading it because it's for class or something. I would read it and it was like, it passes by me. I'm like, yeah, that was a line of text. And then the meaning of the line doesn't fully hit me. Not even if it's, say, that one line about Socrates, that the foundation of a one actual field in philosophy or something.
Right. Well, yeah. So is there a question? I think that's a reaction to any text that isn't written primarily for leisure reading. I think that kind of reaction is just something that it goes away with practice. Like the more you expose yourself to, high literature or philosophy, and you just get used to training your attention on the text. And that kind of reading is just a skill that one learns over the course of many years of practicing.
Yeah.
So I remember, especially when I first got to graduate school, and I was reading these really dense, technical, contemporary philosophy articles in journals. I would have to, it would take me hours and hours to read 10 pages of the text because it was so technical and so dense. And I'd have to read it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And now I can read some of the same stuff like, casually, while listening to the radio, and, thinking about something else. I can still pick up the main ideas,
right,
even if all the details don't necessarily stick. But I remember when I first started reading that kind of stuff, I couldn't even get the main ideas without sort of reading it 4 times, in complete silence, concentrating on every word.
I think that may be because, like, say, for college students or students in general, when they're reading things like, say, literature or any, like a textbook, they're reading for plot, you could say.
Right.
In terms of, say, a textbook, you're just reading for the facts. Oh, it says this and this and this. And then when you're reading literature, they're reading for plot. What happened?
Yep.
What happened?
Yeah.
But then they don't read into the literature.
Right. And Plato's a really interesting case there because Plato doesn't allow you to read either way.
Yeah.
Students who've never read Plato before, they think they're reading a play. Yeah. And they're looking for plot and maybe a little bit of characterization. But what Plato's doing is he's trying to present you ideas you would normally encounter in an essay. Mm-hmm. Like there are arguments there, but he's doing it in a dialogue form. And so if it's your first exposure to Plato, it can be very puzzling how you're supposed to read Plato.
Yeah, and since it's like a dialogue, a conversation between, say, Socrates as written by Plato and someone else, there is a progression to their dialogue, but it's not quite a narrative.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's another way of putting the same point is it's tempting to try to read Plato if you have no prior exposure to Plato as a narrative, but you can't really read Plato that way. Yeah. So, yeah, and that's probably something I should be a little bit clear about in the early days of intro. I think that might minimize some early confusion in that course. It's something I'm so used to, it just fades into the background and I forget all about that. Reading Plato is not going to be like reading anything they've ever encountered before. So, so it's good to have my own attention sort of.
Just grab all the copies of the 5 dialogues at the bookstore. Just write, these are not stories.
Right.
When you complete your doctorate, what do you think that'll be like? What do you think you'll feel when you finally complete?
I mean, it's been so long in coming, and there have been so many false starts, or not. Well, I guess they're not really false starts, but they're it's gone off the rails on a number of occasions here. I mean, it's obviously going to be a huge relief.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's going to come with its own set of challenges. The academic job market is just, especially in philosophy, is so challenging and so appallingly bad right now. I mean, I've been lucky to have full-time teaching at Hartford with an incomplete PhD. That's not really supposed to happen.
Right.
But yeah, it'll, when the PhD is finished, I mean, at that point, I'll finally be able to apply for all the tenure track jobs that are out there for schools that are looking for somebody who works in Greek philosophy. And, then if I'm lucky enough to get one of those jobs, then in order to keep it, I have to get tenure. And in all probability, the job will be a research job. And to get tenure, you have to publish. And so there'll be pressure on me to produce a lot of publications right off the bat.
I remember hearing you say you were working on a book.
Well, that book is my dissertation. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So right now the plan is, if the dissertation turns out the way I think it's going to turn out, I think what I do in the dissertation stands a good chance of getting turned into a book manuscript pretty quickly after it's finished. I'm a little hesitant to say that out loud, because...
Let alone on a recording?
Yeah. But I'm fairly I think the project is original and makes an important contribution to scholarship on Euthyphro. I anticipate, it won't be able to be published in the form that it's going to be in October. But I think that after a couple of years of continuing to develop the ideas and continuing to tinker with the manuscript, it's something that could wind up in print. So that's probably all I should say about that. Yeah. I mean, if that happens, I mean, that would go a long way toward helping with the tenure process when that time comes.
Right, okay.
So,
all right, we can stop there.
Okay. Is that enough material for you? Is that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. Like an hour-ish.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, sure.